Duet for Cello and Plain is the 22nd and final episode of the second season of Wings. As always, there will be spoilers as I talk about what happens in this. I think this is a really strong final episode to this season. It starts off with Lowell teaching himself to cha-cha. It's a nice, light-hearted way to start things off. We have a tiny subplot with a woman waiting in the airport for somebody, we don't know who. Faye is very kind to her, offers her to stay at her house. This woman doesn't speak English, but she's able to communicate. Roy is not very nice. He shoos her at one point, and the woman basically ends up calling him an ass. It was a fun part of the episode. I liked it, but it was definitely padding for the main narrative. So I'll now go through the bulk of the episode in chronological order and share some thoughts along the way. And I will say the ending, I know what happens next. I've seen the next season, but the ending is definitely a very strong one. So Helen is practicing her cello. It turns out she's got an audition for the main orchestra, and that's main as in M-A-I-N-E, not M-A-I-N. And she goes there, and actually one of her former students, a kid called Becky, is there. And we very quickly realise that Becky is an incredible cellist. She is obviously some kind of musical prodigy. It seems like Helen doesn't stand a chance. But then we find out that Helen got the job. And I feel like there are a lot of unpredictable things in this one, but it turns out, unpredictably in my opinion, that Becky intentionally played badly. She doesn't say this to Helen, but she tells this to Jo when she's at the airport, because she and her mother were going down to Nantucket, and it turns out Becky didn't want to be away from her boyfriend. And Becky, bearing in mind she's a child still, is talking about how she didn't want to have this long-distance relationship and there were too many temptations on the road. And obviously Jo is listening to this young child saying how his current girlfriend is going to be going on the road and there are going to be potential temptations. And Jo starts to wonder whether he should ask her to stay, but he realises he can't do that, because if he asks her to stay, he's constantly going to be worrying about the fact that he was the one who made her give up this dream and give up this opportunity. Who knows when another opportunity like this will come along. But we have an interesting conversation between Jo and Helen, where Helen says, if you want me to stay, I'll stay. This is before Jo has said anything to her, and part of me thinks maybe Helen was wanting Jo to say that because it would be a sign of commitment. I don't think she wanted to give up this opportunity, but part of me thinks that Jo committing to her would be significantly more important to her than this job, which I think is quite telling about how she feels about Jo. But Jo is adamant he couldn't possibly ask her to give up this dream. And Helen then says, well, come to Maine with me. And Jo says that he can't do that. He can't leave his airport. He can't leave Sandpiper Air. And I will be fair on Jo here. Helen tried to compare her willingness to stay in Nantucket with Jo going to Maine. But that's not fair, because Jo has an established business. He's obviously put a lot of time and money into this. Helen's career with the main orchestra technically hasn't even begun yet. So that's not equal. That's not a level playing field. I don't like what Helen was suggesting. And neither does Jo, because they break out into this giant fight and they're screaming at each other, and Helen threatens to pierce the plane's tire. And if she does that, Jo is threatening to cut her cello strings, and I genuinely didn't think they were going to do it. But they did. And Helen popped that tire wheel, and I dread to think how much that would have actually cost. And Jo obviously cuts her cello strings, and she sprays grease on him. He uses the fire extinguisher on her. It's beautifully executed. It's very, very well done, and I think their performances are amazing. It's very, very messy. And then we have a phone call for Helen from the orchestra. And this is another thing that I think is quite unpredictable. They've lost the funding. There is no orchestra. There is no job in Maine. And it's a bit awkward, because obviously they've just had this massive fight, so everything's just up in the air. And Helen decides the best thing for her to do, which I don't think is a sensible decision, is to go to New York. Yes, I think following your dreams, taking risks, these are important, but as Jo pointed out to her, she didn't have a job lined up, she didn't have anywhere to stay, but she was still going to do it. And we do have a really sweet moment at the end that I really love. And I think this was the best way to end this episode. Helen is getting on that plane and she's going to New York. And Joe says, I love you. And Helen says it back. And I like that. I like the fact that she's not running away from the relationship. She's not leaving because she no longer loves Joe, but she's leaving because this is something she feels she has to do. And I think that that's believable. I think it would have been unbelievable if she suddenly decided she didn't love Joe and all she had was her career and that's what she was chasing. This feels so much more realistic and believable, and I really, really admire that. It obviously ended on a bit of a cliffhanger because how is Helen going to survive without a job and a place to live? Obviously, I won't say, but I will say that season 3 is brilliant. We have some fun, very fun guest appearances at one point, but I'll say no more about season 3 until we get there. This is a brilliant end to season 2. Definitely a really, really strong episode.